Let's start off today with a little bit of review from last time. Last time we talked about the Kalam cosmological argument. You may remember the premises, but just for the sake of argument, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, again, I'm not saying this is true, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that all the science that we talked about in the previous class is wrong. Let's just postulate that. New discoveries overturn the radiation and the second law of thermodynamics and all the stuff that they appeal to, all is wrong. And we now know, let's say, the universe is eternal. Now, what would happen in that case to arguments for God's existence? Well, there was a guy named Thomas Aquinas, and he actually is the person we're talking about today, and we're going to read for today. And he disagreed with the argument we just talked about last class, the Kalam cosmological argument. He thought that you couldn't prove true or false that the universe was eternal. He believed, as a matter of faith, that it was not eternal, but he thought as a matter of philosophy, as a matter of the science of his time, he thought you could not show that the universe was not eternal. In other words, that minor premise of the argument he rejected. So what was his view? Well, his view was that you could actually have a good reason to think that God exists, even if it were true that the universe was eternal. And so he put forward his famous 5 ways to argue for God's existence. The text I asked you to read for today is one of the most influential and reprinted and controversial of the arguments in philosophy. It really is very, very famous. So if you didn't read it, I would encourage you again to check it out, because it really is one of the most famous bits of philosophy that was ever written. So today we're going to talk about those so-called 5 ways. The first way is from change. Aquinas looks around the world and he says it's evident to our senses that things change. Think about yourself. You may have seen pictures of yourself when you were, 2 years old, and you look in the mirror now, and obviously you don't look like you're 2 years old anymore. And if you're fortunate enough to live and you turn 50, when you look in the mirror, you'll look different still. And at 80, you'll look different still. So it's very evident to our senses that things change. So one of his arguments is based from change, and it concludes to a first unmoved mover. Another argument he gives is that things are caused. And he thinks this is also evidently true, that there are many things around us that we know did not exist before and then came into existence. Thirdly, he talks about contingency. And this is an argument from the fact that the things that exist now do not have to exist. They're not necessary beings. For instance, if our parents had never met, we would not exist. If your mom had never met your dad and they never had any contact, well, then obviously they could have had sex, and obviously you could have resulted from that. Third, he argues from grades of perfection, that there has to be a perfect being. And then finally, he argues from directionality in order. There has to be some intelligent being. So I'm going to break down each one of these arguments and talk about each one. And I'm actually going to start with the second one, the argument from causality. The second way you could summarize in the following way. There are some things that are caused. There are some things that are getting caused. And everything caused is caused by another. And either there's an infinite regress in causes, you just go back, back, back forever, or there is an uncaused cause. And Aquinas argues that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, and therefore there has to be an uncaused cause. So let me break all this down to, again, try to make it easier to understand, hopefully. So let's start off with the first premise. There are some things, at least, that are caused. An easy example of that is a baby. A baby's caused to come into existence by mother and father, right? So some things in this world are caused. And obviously more than babies are caused, like this water thing I have here. This is caused by the company that makes it. Your phone is caused, maybe by Apple. So obviously there are some things that are caused. And the second premise is everything caused is caused by another. So the baby is something that got caused, and it was caused by another, namely by mom and dad. So everything that's caused to come into existence has to be caused by something else. Now, one of the reasons that he thinks this is actually something we talked about last time, that nothing can cause itself to come into existence. And the reason is fairly simple. Something that does not exist, like your great-granddaughter, can't do anything, right? Your great-granddaughter can't do anything right now. Maybe in 20 years, or not 20 years, 40 years from now, maybe she'll be able to. But right now, she can't. So your great-granddaughter can't do anything. And if she can't do anything, she can't cause anything. And if she can't cause anything, obviously she can't cause herself. So if something's going to come into existence, it has to be caused by something else. Now, this is a very important distinction that is not explicitly made in Aquinas' essay that I asked you to read, but you're not going to understand his essay unless you understand this distinction. And the distinction is between two kinds of causes: para-accidens causes and Parasai causes. Now, what's the difference? In a para-accidens cause, the initial cause can go away and the effects of that cause continue. So if you knock over dominoes, a man and a woman make a baby, and then the baby herself has a baby later, and then that woman herself has a baby later, and so on. Eventually, the initial parents can die, but then the subsequent children continue to exist. Or like in the example of the dominoes, when you knock the first domino over, it'll knock over the second, knock over the third, knock over the fourth, etc. But you could totally take away the first domino, and the rest of the knocking over of dominoes in this chain can continue. By contrast, there's such a thing as a Parasai cause. Now, what is a Parasai cause? A Parasai cause might be illustrated by a locomotive that is pulling along the various links in the chain of the train behind it. And if that locomotive were to totally stop, well, all the chains that it's pulling along also are going to stop, right? So the whole chain is being pulled along by that initial first causer, that initial locomotive. So here's another example. Your great-grandfather caused your grandfather. Your grandfather caused your dad. Your dad caused you. But your great-great-grandfather now is probably dead. And the fact that certainly your great-great-great-great-grandfather's dead, the fact that that person's dead does not mean that you die, right? You continue to exist. So the difference between a para-accidens order of causality and a Parasai is this. In a para-accidens order of causality, you can get rid of the prior links in the chain, and the subsequent links in the chain still can exist. So you can get rid of, say, my grandmother's dead. Both my grandmothers are dead, but I still continue to exist. My grandfathers are dead, but I still continue to exist. And so that's an example of a para-accidens chain of causality. By contrast, with Parasai causality, if you get rid of the initial thing pulling all the subsequent links in the chain along, it gets rid of the whole process. The whole process doesn't move. So think of a water bottle. The water is getting caused to exist where it is by the plastic bottle. Now, if you got rid of the plastic bottle, if you melted it or blew it up or whatever, the water is not just going to stay in midair, it's going to fall to the ground. And the plastic bottle itself is getting caused right now to exist where it is. It's getting caused by, say, the table. So if you got rid of the table, well, that would get rid of the plastic bottle being where it is, and that would get rid of the water being where it is. So the water is being caused by the plastic is being caused by the table, and if you get rid of any one of those, it's going to disrupt those that depend on it. So that's a per se order of causality. And that means that if you get rid of the earlier links in the chain, you get rid of the subsequent links. All right, so is this example here, we've got a flower pot sitting there, right? And the flower pot's getting held up by this circular thing, and the circular thing is being held up by the chain, and the chain, each link of the chain is held up by the previous link, and it's all connected to the ceiling. So is this an example of para-accidens causality or Parasai causality? Because if you were to get rid of any one of those links in the chain, what would happen is the plant would fall down, right? Each link is holding up the subsequent links. So that's an example of Parasai causality. So you might say, if you broke it down, you might say, look, you've got link A, right, near the top there, and link A is hooked up to the ceiling. And you got link B a little bit further down. And then you got link C, still a little bit further down. And then you got link D, still further down. And if you get rid of, say, link B, well, link C and D are not just going to float in midair and just sit there, right? They're going to fall down. If you get rid of link A, it'll fall down. So this is an essentially ordered series. That is to say, it's a Parasai causal series. The subsequent links depend on the previous links. What does that matter? Well, it matters for Aquinas' argument, because here's what he's going to say. When you have a Parasai order, the causality is asymmetric. And what I mean by that is that, say, D, in this link I've made there, D depends on A, but A does not depend on D. In other words, you can get rid of D and A is fine. It just sits there and it does its thing. Whereas if you get rid of A, it will make D go away. So whatever causal power, say, D has, derives from something else. D is only able to do what it can do, hold up the plant, because of C. And C can only do what it's going to do because of B. And B can only do what it's going to do because of A. Each link earlier derives its power from someone else, from a prior causer, you might say. So the idea here is that the subsequent links are instrumental to the first link. So let me ask you this. What causes you to exist right now, not in the para-accidens order, but in the Parasai order? In other words, in the para-accidens order, what caused you to come into existence are your parents, and your parents were caused by your grandparents, etc. But I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about what causes you to continue to exist in the Parasai order. That is to say, even if your parents were dead and your grandparents were dead, everyone's dead, you can still continue existing. But there are some things that are causing you to exist right now in the Parasai order of causality. So what are those things? Now, like if you think about food or water, you could continue to exist for a little while without those things. In other words, if you were deprived right now of all food and water, you wouldn't just drop dead immediately, right? You'd be able to live for, well, I think without food, can't you live without food for about 3 weeks or so, or 4 weeks or something? Without water, you die, 5 days, whatever. But you could, you could survive for a little while without those things. So oxygen is something we really need in order to continue to exist. And we can't survive without oxygen any more than, I think about 10 minutes is the most. If you're deprived of oxygen for 10 minutes, basically you have brain death and you basically just, that's it, you're gone. Unless, the one exception I've read is if you're really cold, like if you were to be like in a frozen kind of river, it's really cold, apparently can exist a little longer than 10 minutes, but basically it's around 10 minutes. Certainly at, not freezing temperatures, it's about 10 minutes. Okay, so we need gravity, we need atmospheric pressure, and atmospheric pressure is a great example. Because atmospheric pressure, if it were to radically change, that would instantly kill us. So for instance, if we were to take you, not that we would do this, but put you at the bottom of the sea, just like put you down there with no submarine, you would die right away, right? Because the atmospheric pressure at the bottom of the ocean is so strong, it would just crush you. And you would you'd be dead, you'd be crushed. And if you were shot out into space with no atmospheric pressure, no spacesuit, and there too, you would die, and it would be the opposite. You'd explode because the atmospheric pressure, basically the reason you don't explode now is that it's right between. But if you were way off in space without a spacesuit, you die right away there too. So basically, we're getting caused, not just by our parents in the para-accidens order, that's true, but right now, here and now, today, this minute, I'm being caused to continue to exist, and you are being caused to continue to exist. And if you got rid of atmospheric pressure, oxygen, water, lots of different things, we would die, especially atmospheric pressure. We die right away. We got crushed. Okay, so what's causing us to exist? Among many things, atmospheric pressure. Now, what causes atmospheric pressure to exist? In other words, why is the atmospheric pressure what it is? Why is it not like what it is at the bottom of the sea or like what it is in outer space? Well, one of the things causing atmospheric pressure to be what it is the temperature. In other words, atmospheric pressure changes if you change the temperature. If the temperature gets a lot hotter, the atmospheric pressure would change. If the temperature were a lot cooler, then the atmospheric pressure would also change. So the cause of us, namely atmospheric pressure, is itself getting caused. Temperature is something that changes, it gets caused. All right, so we have an original thing that's getting caused, you and me, and that is caused by what? Atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure in turn is itself getting caused by temperature. So what you have is an essentially ordered series, a Parasite ordering. Now, if there are only intermediate and derivative causes, then there would be no source from which all the causal powers of the intermediate causes could be derived. If there were only intermediate causes, then the intermediate causes would be powerless to cause the things that they're causing. The derivative cause would not be able to cause anything. But we clearly know the derivative causes can cause things, right? We have the temperature causing atmospheric pressure, the atmospheric pressure causing us to continue to exist. So if that reasoning is correct, there cannot be only derivative causes. There has to be something that is an underderivative cause, you might say. So you might liken it to sharing a pizza. So let's say we are sitting around a table and someone hands you this thing of pizza, you take a piece, you hand it on to the next person, they take a piece, they hand it on to the next person, they take a piece, they hand it on to the next person, and they take a piece. So in that case, there's a chain of causality. But unless someone brings the pizza to start with, right, there is no pizza to be shared. Unless someone brings the causal power to start with, there can't be the causal power to be shared. There can't be, in other words, only derivative causes. So Aquinas thinks that there can't be an infinite regress in Parasai causes. A cause is either in itself uncaused or itself also getting caused. And if a cause is itself getting caused, like atmospheric pressure, well, then we've not yet explained what caused the thing that we're trying to explain. So if we were trying to figure out, for instance, why human beings continue to exist, and then we appeal to atmospheric pressure, which is itself getting caused, we're simply restating the problem at a different level. So a sufficient explanation demands that there be an uncaused cause. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, how there can't be an actual infinity of causes made through finite addition. If there were an infinity of Parasite causes, then there would be an actual infinity made up by finite addition. That is to say, we're getting caused by something else finite, namely atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is getting caused by something else finite, namely the temperature, and so on and so on. Well, if there were an infinite regress in Parasite causes, then the whole chain would be actually infinite. But can there be an infinite regress in these causes? And we saw before how there can't be. It's impossible to have an actual infinity of causes made through finite addition. In other words, we remember gave the example of shoveling on the sand. So to break it down again for you guys, it looks something like this. First, there are some things that are getting caused. You, me, your phone, the plants you see, etc. Secondly, everything that's getting caused in the Parasite order is getting caused by something else. Either there's an infinite regress in causes, or there is an uncaused cause. And Aquinas thinks there can't be an infinite regress in causes, and therefore there has to be an uncaused cause. And Aquinas calls the uncaused cause God. So this is the argument from causality. So here's an objection to the second way. How about this? Well, if everything has a cause, what caused God? Right? If everything had a cause, what caused God? So let's see what you guys, if you were Aquinas, how would you respond to this objection? So imagine you're Aquinas. how would you respond to this objection? If everything has a cause, well, what caused God? It's not true that everything has a cause, right? He doesn't think God is something caused. So Thomas does not say everything has a cause. Rather, he says something different. He says everything caused is caused by another. If we go back to the argument here, right, it doesn't say anywhere in that argument everything is caused. It says something different. It says everything that is getting caused is caused by another. That's a totally different thing. So he doesn't say everything is caused. So this question, who caused God, is a question that Aquinas at least would say is a nonsense question. So we talked a little bit about this last class. If I ask you, well, how much does the number 4 weigh, right? How much does the number 4 weigh? What would you say to that question? So the words, how much does the number 4 weigh? That sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, but if you really know what the number 4 is, well, then it doesn't really make sense. So what about this? Even if atheism is right, there is no answer to the question, who caused God? Why? Well, because if atheism is right, there is no God. But the question, who caused God, wouldn't make sense because there's no such being as God. It'd be like the question, well, who's the father of Santa Claus? Or where did you bury your mother alive? Where did you bury your mother alive? The supposition of that question is that she did bury her mother alive. And I'm just trying to figure out where. The supposition of who caused God is what? That God is something that's getting caused. But if Aquinas is right, God is not getting caused. God is an uncaused cause. So certainly on the theistic view, the question, who caused God, doesn't really make sense because God is an uncaused cause. And the question, who caused God, also doesn't make sense if atheism is correct, because there's no such thing as God. Just like the question, who's the father of Santa Claus, doesn't really make sense. There is no Santa Claus, right? Who's the mother of the tooth fairy? There is no such thing as a tooth fairy. The tooth fairy doesn't have a mother because the tooth fairy doesn't even exist. So whether or not atheism is correct, the question, who caused God, doesn't make sense. And the reason is that those questions have a false implicit supposition. So whether atheism is true or whether theism is true, who made God is a nonsense question, right? It's a question, again, like how much does the number 4 weigh, or how long is the color yellow, or where did you bury your mother alive? That question could theoretically make sense, actually, though, because you could, in fact, bury your mother alive. But the question, how long is the color yellow, just doesn't make sense because colors just don't have any particular length. So let's talk about now the first way. The first way begins with the fact of movement. Aquinas notices movement change in the world. And he says whatever is moved by another. And there cannot be an infinite regress in movers. And therefore there must be a first mover, which is called God. So let me break this down for you to kind of hopefully make it a little easier to understand. Aquinas understands movement as a relationship between act and potency. And what does that mean? So movement he defines as the act of a being in potency insofar as it is in potency. And what does that mean? What that means is that you have, say, water. Now the water is actually room temperature, but then I put a fire underneath it, and the potency of the water to boil becomes actualized. So the water moves or changes. It moves from being room temperature, and then when the fire is applied underneath it, then it changes and it becomes boiling water, it becomes hot water. So it moves from being potentially boiling to being actually boiling. So act and potency are Aquinas' ways of describing changes. So motion for Thomas is the act of a being in potency insofar as it is in potency. In other words, motion is that change that comes from something being just merely potential to being actualized. So if you think of this woman jogging on the trail, when she was way at the back of the trail there, she had the potential to be where she is now. And that potential was actualized and realized. Now she's in the middle of the trail, but she has the potential to be further down the trail. And if she gets there, that potential that she has to be further down the trail, that potential will be actualized. So this is just a way of analyzing what change is. Change is, you might say, a middle point between potency and act. So we talked before about the difference between para-accidens and Parasai movers, or Parasite Causality. But the same principle between Parasai and para-accidens can apply to movers. You can have something that moves you para-accidens. In other words, you can get rid of that mover and you continue moving. But you could also have something that moves you per se. And so what Aquinas says is that there can't be a infinite regress in Parasai movers, for all the reasons that we talked about before, that there can't be an infinite regress of Parasai causes. So if everything moves, what moves God? Aquinas' answer to this would be similar to the answer that we gave a little bit earlier, that Aquinas does not say that everything is in motion, but he says only that some things are in motion. Nor does he say that everything is moved by something else, but only that whatever is in motion is moved by something else. Hence, it will not do to ask, doesn't that mean God is in motion, or what moves God? Because he's not claiming that everything is in motion, or that whatever is in, or that everything is getting moved. For there's nothing in Aquinas' premises that implies that God would have to be like everything else, or that he must be moved like everyone else. So the first way that we're talking about now is similar in form to the second way, but it concludes to a different conclusion, namely that there's an unmoved mover. The first argument, the argument we just talked about a moment ago, concludes to there's an uncaused cause. So I'll ask you again, do you agree with the premises of this first way, that there's motion? I didn't write that down, but it's implied. Some things are moving, some things are changed. Whatever is moved by another. There cannot be an infinite regress in movers. Therefore, there must be a first mover, an unmoved mover, which people generally give the name God. Now, I should emphasize that Aquinas, you don't need to call this God. And in fact, Aquinas did not call this being God. What he actually said was Deus, Latin for God. But it doesn't matter what you call it. The idea is there has to be a first unmoved mover. Look, couldn't the first cause or the first mover just start things off and then cease? In other words, like the domino. So if we have the dominoes all lined up and you knock over the first domino, the domino thing can continue knocking over the further dominoes, and you can just get rid of and throw in the garbage the first domino, right? Because it just keeps going. Now, the question then is there such a thing as Parasite Causality? In other words, the dominoes is a great example of para-accidens causality. But is there such a thing as Parasai Causality? Are there some things that are getting caused? And it seems, at least arguably, that we would be an example of something that is getting caused, in not just in the para-accidens order, but in the Parasai order. Because it's clear, right, in the para-accidens order, we can get rid of our great-great-great-grandparents, and we still continue to exist, right? Like none of us here, I imagine, unless you have an amazing relative, has a great-great-great, grandfather that's still around, right? They're all dead. But we're still here. But that's para-accidens causality. If there's such a thing as Parasai Causality, what Parasai Causality is the idea that our continued existence depends on the continued existence of these things that are causing us to continue to be right now, like temperature. So if I took you and I put you on the sun, obviously you die right away, right? You just be burned to smithereens. And if I took you and put you in negative, whatever, 100 or 235, also you die right away. So for you to continue to exist, the temperature has to be within a certain level. And if it gets way too hot, you die. If it gets way too cold, you die. Same thing's true of atmospheric pressure. So the idea is that you and I not only are caused by para-accidens causality way back in the day, but are getting caused right now in the Parasai order, right? Not just back in the day, but right now we're getting caused. And if the temperature or atmospheric pressure or whatever were to radically shift, right now we would die, right? That would be the end of us. That's the idea of Parasite Causality. So one way out of this argument, if we have an order of Parasite Causality, then what that means is there has to be a dependence right now on the prior causes. Otherwise, the subsequent causes are not going to be able to operate. And then whatever is getting caused all the way down the chain is not going to be able to do its thing. So if there's a per se order of causality, then there does have to be something holding it up. Let me talk about the third way. The third way is that there are some things that are able to be and not to be because they're generated and corrupted. So to be generated and to be corrupted is, for in Aquinas' terms, to be a contingent being. Now he says not all things can be generated and corrupted because then they would have to generate themselves before they exist. So there must be something whose existence is necessary, a necessary being. And Aquinas calls this necessary being God. So let's talk about the fourth way briefly. And the fourth way basically is a proof that begins from grades of perfection and notes that among beings, there's some more or less good, true, noble, and the like. And that things are said to be more or less a certain way to the extent they resemble some maximum. In other words, things are said to be hotter as they more nearly resemble that which is hottest. But in that case, it follows that there is something which is truest, something best, something most noble, and consequently something which is uttermost being. And those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being. And the maximum within any genus is the cause of everything in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum of heat, is the cause of all things hot. So this argument, again, is pretty complex, but I think we can recast it, hopefully, in a more easier to understand sort of way. And contemporary people have recast this as the moral argument for God's existence. What I want to do now is raise some serious problems for Aquinas' 5 ways. And there are a number of them. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the problems right now, but I'll talk about a few of them. If you have things that are getting caused, there needs to be at least one cause. But why couldn't there be more than one cause? In other words, nothing in Aquinas' argument excludes the possibility that there's 2 or 3 or 47 uncaused causes. Nothing in his argument excludes that there's 47 or 5,000 unmoved movers or millions of necessary beings. In fact, nothing in his argument shows that the uncaused cause is the same being as the unmoved mover, and the unmoved mover is the same being as the necessary being. So Aquinas' arguments, in fact, might prove too much. He has 5 ways. Well, that proves 5 different gods. He proves, in other words, not monotheism, but polytheism. And if he proves polytheism, that's a big problem, at least for him, because he claims to believe in only one God. That's one problem for Aquinas. Another problem for Aquinas is that there's a difference between the God of Abraham and the God of philosophers. In other words, the God of Abraham is a God who loves us, a God who knows us, a God who intervenes in history. But all that Aquinas has shown is that there has to be an uncaused cause. Well, why in the world should we think that an uncaused cause even knows we exist? Maybe it's just like some energy out there that causes things, and that's the end of it. Doesn't know us, doesn't love us, doesn't intervene in history, does nothing of the sort. So the God of Abraham, by contrast, is a God that knows us, that loves us, that intervenes in history. And Aquinas has not proved that at all. At best, what he's done is show there's some, unmoved mover, and that's very, very far from a real uncaused cause, or the God of Abraham, rather. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Aquinas has done nothing at all to solve the so-called problem of evil. We'll talk in later classes about the problem of evil, but it can be simply stated. If God is all-powerful, then God can get rid of all evil. If God is all good, then God would want to get rid of all evil. If God is all-knowing, then God knows about evil. But clearly, there is evil in the world. So we have non-moral evils, like people suffering from disease. We have moral evils, like people being discriminatory against others simply for their race, their religion, their ethnic background. So clearly, there is evil. But if there's evil in the world, then either God is not all good, or God is not all knowing. Maybe he's not aware that there's evil in the world, or maybe God is not all powerful. and he knows there's evil and he wants to get rid of evil, but he just is too weak and lacking power and can't get rid of evil. But it's impossible that there could be an all good, all knowing, and all powerful God, and also that there's evil in the world. But clearly, all of us know from our own experience that there is evil in the world. There's no two ways about it. And so the God that Aquinas thinks exists must not exist. So what we're going to do moving forward is continue to think about these issues, because it seems that Aquinas' 5 ways, even if they prove something, don't seem up to the task of proving what needs to be proven. At least that's what some people think.